In this section, the main topic has been how come some civilization that seemed poised for world domination eventually declined and then missed out the boat. We focused on places like Ottoman Turkey, Mughal India, Manchu China, Tokugawa Japan, and throughout there was kind of a tug-of-war between two different hypotheses. Is it connected to outside bullying, gunboat diplomacy, or did those various empires plateaued and eventually declined because their own leaders were too timid? And it's kind of difficult to know the answer because we can't isolate one case or the other. If you were a scientist and you were trying to figure out the connection between one causal factor and the consequence, you would just have a whole bunch of test tubes and then try the different ingredients isolated and then have one test tube as kind of a witness. In history, we can't do it because it's a messy field where everything is always interconnected, unless you could find some place that is so isolated from the rest of the world that outside factors are clearly not playing a role. Well, that place exists. It is Easter Island, a civilization that was once thriving and then collapsed long before Europeans ever even got to Easter Island. So maybe we could study that and figure out what can cause civilizations to collapse. Stay tuned. In a previous video, we went through the history of Easter Island. Long story short, this was an area that was settled probably around the year 1200 by Polynesian migrants. And as it did so, they encountered an island that was thriving with various kinds of birds, rare species of trees, and the population ballooned from a few dozen settlers all the way to a peak of maybe 15,000 people. In the process, they built the gigantic statues, the moai, that the island is famous for. When we studied the first European arrival, however, 1722, Jacob Roggeveen, and later on in the century, various visits by explorers like James Cook, we noticed that the island was not doing that well by then. The population had dropped to maybe 3,000 people. So clearly something had gone wrong, and this was long before the European arrival. So what could that be? If you're interested in that topic, I would recommend reading the book by Jared Diamond called Collapse, which is about, well, just what the title indicates. Why is it that some civilizations collapse? And Jared Diamond, being of a biological background, tends to interpret history through the prism of biology. And to him, civilizations, or at least some civilizations, collapse when they mishandle their environment, over-harvest their resources, and then fall victim to maybe a drought and so forth. And in that book, he has different chapters, where there is on the Vikings around the year 1500 in Greenland, or the Mayas of Central America. But the first chapter, and a very interesting one that I used when working on that lecture, is focusing on Easter Island. And his theory would go kind of like that as the population of Easter Island grew, they had to cut down trees just to make more room for their people. And also to use when building the statues are made of stone, but you would need trees to use as logs to carry the statue or to make ropes with the bark. And so an island that was once kind of a Garden of Eden covered with trees, according to the archaeological record, became more and more barren. Which could be an issue if you're an island in the middle of the Pacific, because you have a lot of wind erosion, and that became a problem in the long run, that the soil became exhausted due to too many people living on the land and not enough trees to retain the soil together. Beyond that, Polynesians would have brought with them a species of rat from Polynesia that then attacked the seeds and the birds and their eggs, and eventually completely changed the environment in that regard. And so that's a good example of how human beings have changed the environment of that island. And islands tend to be quite fragile. Because they are so isolated, they often have a unique ecosystem that had developed in isolation from the rest of the world. And because the local species are never really exposed to outside predators, they can often be quite weak. And whenever there is settlement from the outside, all of a sudden they can collapse. A good example of that would be the dodo bird from the island of Mauritius that was quickly pushed into extinction. So there's some evidence that after that initial boom of the island, the population hit a wall of overpopulation, and then malnutrition or even starvation, and then war, and the population started to go down to those environmental stresses. Also, if you have no access to trees anymore, then it becomes more difficult to build ships, and so just the notion of going out to fish becomes quite complicated. And that's supposed to have been reflected in the political environment as well. that an island that used to be quite peaceful with one overall king and then 9 clans dividing the island's resources peacefully, that this became far more dramatic in terms of the politics as the centuries went on, because now you have fewer resources and people started to go to war with each other. The evidence is still disputed, but there is evidence of cannibalism as well. So that's the situation as of the 18th century when the Europeans came in. And so you could say that you can't blame outside gunboat diplomacy at that time because it's all internal factors, poor stewardship of the environment. And that collapse continued in the 18th and 19th century when you have some occasional visits by Europeans, and each of them noticed that the population had gone down even further and the wars were even more terrible. It's during that period that you have the appearance of the cult of the Birdman, or to put it differently, the first egg hunts of Easter Island. And it's a story about Easter Island, so I'd better have some egg hunts in the mix, right? Don't imagine those egg hunts where you have cute little girls in cute flowery dresses running around looking for eggs and bunnies. That's not that kind of egg hunt, something more muscular. If you're interested in seeing that egg hunt, I would recommend watching the movie Rapa Nui, which is from the 1990s. I think it was produced by Kevin Costner. It's a movie that is set in Easter Island. It was actually shot on location. And that retraces kind of the moment where the island is starting to hit a rough patch as the last trees have been cut down and the tensions start to arise. So very interesting. And there's a scene in there where they recreate the egg hunt of Easter Island. So how did that work? Well, each of the clans would select a champion, think of it as like the Olympics of Easter Island, and that young athlete would be expected to go from the southwestern tip of the island into 2 nearby islets that are just like half a mile, 1 mile offshore. And that would be a very dangerous race because you have to run down the cliff, swim across raging waters, trying not to sink of sharks or any kind of dangerous thing that you might have there, and get to one of the islets where you still have birds. This area has not been infested by rats, so you still have a few birds, and they produce eggs, and that's one of the last sources of protein that you can have access to. When you get there quickly, you kind of rummage through the island looking for a nest, you fight mama bird, get the egg away from her while trying not to be pecked too much. But if you manage to make it back to the main island first, back up the cliff, back to your starting point, then you are the Birdman of the year. So that practice is really symbolic of a change in the culture of Easter Island towards something that is more warlike, bellicose, and also a change in the religious worldview away from the building of the statues to the Birdman cult. Because by that late stage, the statues are no longer built. Instead, there's not enough resources to build them anymore, and people have lost faith in those statues, that those gods that were supposed to protect the island have failed, that the population has collapsed, war has become the norm, and so there's anger against those statues. And there's evidence that the cult of the big statue, the Moais, kind of ended all of a sudden. A lot of them are still unfinished in the quarry or kind of halfway down the slope on their way to the coastline, and it's as if people are just dropped their tools and said, that's it, I'm not worshipping those statues anymore. They have failed to protect me. Instead, switched to a different cult, that of the Birdman. So far, you can't quite blame outside influence for the reason why Easter Island collapsed. This was an area that really evolved in isolation, complete isolation up until 1722, and even with very occasional European interference in the century that followed. Things changed from the mid to the late 19th century, however. When you have a number of raids from Peru in South America to Easter Island to capture essentially slaves to harvest guano in South America. What is guano? Well, that's bat dung or bird poop as well. And you do have a number of islands just off the coast of Peru that are very rich in birds, and the birds do what they do, and so you have huge layers of bird poop. What is the value in that? Well, in the 19th century, there is a lot of value. It's a time when the population of the world skyrocketed, and we studied that in the Industrial Revolution video when we talked about the demographic transition. And for a while, there was a lot of fear by people like Malthus that the population would balloon so much that the agriculture could not follow, and then you wouldn't have world famine. One way to alleviate that would be to use fertilizers. Well, you don't have synthetic fertilizers derived from oil yet, or nitrates. So the way to get fertilizers back in the 19th century is to get natural fertilizers, and that's where the bird poop comes along. So getting to guano was a key resource in the 19th century. In fact, the US Congress even passed something called the Guano Act, where the US Congress claimed every uninhabited island in the world where there was some bird poop. And other countries said, no, that's my bird poop, not yours. So anyways, off the coast of Peru, there was a lot of efforts to harvest the guano, and it's not a very glamorous or interesting job. So that's why slaves were employed, and that's why you have a slave raid to Easter Island to capture about 1,500 slaves, so half the population of Easter Island. When that happened, however, there was an international outcry because it's mid to the late 19th century, and as a result, the population of the world has kind of turned away against slavery, and the international community that used to condone slavery back in the 18th century is now considering it to be a kind of a crime against humanity. And due to international pressure, Peru eventually repatriated the survivors of that slave raid back to Easter Island. Except when they did that, they brought with them diseases that they had been exposed to, like smallpox, like tuberculosis. And then that started a major epidemic in Easter Island, affecting the former slaves, all the people that had remained in Easter Island, and then were reunited with their loved ones. And so the population that used to be maybe 3,000 in the early 19th century dipped to a low of, I think, 111 in the late 19th century. And for that purpose, you could, to some extent, blame outside influence. It was kind of the death knell at the very end. So where is Easter Island nowadays? Well, it's now part of Chile, and the population has recovered, either people that are of actual Rapa Nui descent or more Hispanic settlers from Chile, or a lot of tourism. That's the main industry in Easter Island nowadays. So things are looking up in the more modern world. But what does that teach us about the big story that we were interested in for the whole section? Why is it that some civilizations that seem poised for success, how did they collapse? Well, the big answer could be the environment. There is evidence for that in Easter Island. Internal governments, poor management of your resources, and there's definitely evidence of that as well, or outside influence by slave traders, by colonizers, and there is some evidence of that as well, though very late in the process. So I'll let you ponder all these issues, and next time we'll shift section altogether and embark on a whole different journey. See you next time.